Dun, 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 dun. Dun, dun, dun. Hey, everybody, this is True Powers Mine, and welcome to the show. I'm still sick, stopped up nose. But I wanted to do a show today, basically about the earth. Judging from the last poll, the second to the last poll we done on the channel, there was a not quite 50-50. I think it was like 60-30 or something like that, or 70-30, that people were asked if the earth is flat or is it round. Now, I did some research on the, hold on 1 second. I just want to make sure those numbers were right that I gave you. Go down and over. I don't even. I guess. Yeah, that's what it was. It was 68-32. Now I know a lot of people have their beliefs. A lot of people have their opinion. And then a lot of people have their facts on this issue. And the only reason why I bring this up today is because don't you find it incredibly odd, folks, that in 2013 the United States government basically said it was legal for a news institution to basically air propaganda. And now in 2019 we're actually having a conversation about fake news. So hold on. That's odd. But I will like to play this real quick. Now you really can't see it with some of these clouds. Person that told me to check this video out said if you really look sharply, some of these clouds are basically like cut and paste job. You can see the same pattern repeat itself, and we all know that when you look at clouds, yeah, sometimes a few of them are similar, but they're never identical. Hold on, this was one of Nick's videos, but I can't get.
Peace, love and light, North Star family. This is another sky update. I know it's been a while. I don't post as frequently as I normally used to, but hey, I'm going through a change. This is an evolutionary change, but as we can see up here, I know I can tell you on one hand, a lot of things have been changing around us as far as what worldwide is supposed to be the eastern part of the country is supposed to be freezing, supposed to have an Arctic chill coming soon. While on the west it's extra dry out here, all the forest fires, all of the heat. Right now it's supposed to be it's like roughly 60, 65, 70, sitting directly in the sun. But today's high is supposed to be maybe 76, maybe 80. I know this whole week has been hitting in the 80s, but normally around this time it's supposed to be actually the same temperature, but we've been getting a lot of emotional mixed weather patterns. It don't really make sense. But I'll post y'all a video on from Ventuski or Ventusky that'll depict what I'm saying. I'll give y'all the actual the temperature thermal graphs and the different rain patterns and precipitation patterns for the most part. But um, but as far as this manipulation of the weather, we already know is prominent, is prevalent. It hasn't been that much chemtrail. Like I don't know, this whole week, to say the least. Um, it's been a long week for me, but this week in general, I haven't seen any chemtrail. I noticed it's very warm out here. Very warm at this time. Like I said, they still got the forest fires that were burning in California. I don't know if they're still going right now, but the devastation of supposed fires. But those storms, those fires were created that we all know that they're being created and then being put out by the same people that started the fire. So they'll say direct energy weapons, which is it's plausible. It's a plausible way, plausible cause of fires, and also they're using all these techniques to put out the fires or whatever. But that's irrelevant at this point. We should be more focused on the change that's been ready to come. We all feel it in our bones. A lot of shit. It seems like every other week there's an increase in there's a rapid increase of distractions that come at us through social media, whether it's through basically going to your everyday job. If you work, there's a bunch of distraction, a lot of changes. I feel it in my body. I just feel it in my soul, not my spirit, because people say that we're spirit beings, and we're energy spirit beings. No, but the spirit comes from the white people, and our soul, we're soul beings. Why do you think they call it soul training? Soul training was a show based off a lot of black folks, dancing with their soul, to soul music, to all types of genres of music, but all of it was based on soul. If you don't like no, for example, his brother at my workplace in James Brown, everybody was in there because it was grew into James Brown because we all had that soul. Keep in mind, we're all brothers in there. We're all brothers in there, and we have soul. The only person that didn't get down to it was this white man because he don't have no soul. He has a spirit. His spirit doesn't resonate with the energy and the sound waves of soul music. Keep in mind, like I was saying, cymatics is a frequency that can heal you. Cymatic sounds the frequencies can heal your body from all kinds of cancers and all types of like negative energies that's put in your body that will affect you mentally and physically. But you playing that right tone, that that 865 hertz, it will heal your body. But our solar plexus can pick up on higher frequencies of energy and vibrations from the sun. and we're absorbing it in. We're the only people that have solar plexus on this planet, aka the carbon man, aka the indigenous persons of the Americas and all other countries of copper colored skin. We are Americans, copper colored people. We we have this ability that others claim they do, but they don't. Their their point of what you say solar plexus are chakras, and we have chakras too, but for the hell of what we have a solar plexus. People say we are, and the thing is, we're learning more about us through a system that was given to us by said white people. And I don't get that. We don't know how to think for ourselves as a collective. We don't know how to think for ourselves, and we rely off what the white man says to be true, and it's not true. They're making this shit up as they go. My thing is this: who gave them their knowledge to know what they know right now? Who gave them that knowledge? We did. The fact that we rely on their welfare, their government systems, everything, etc., from all of these government helping agencies, we stop doing that because we're actually dependent off them, and we don't know how to do for ourselves. The more we keep depending on them, the government, aka Whitey, aka whoever you want to call them, the beast, the more we keep relying off them, the more we become victims. The more, aka, the more, aka Whitey, aka Beast, becomes our gods. In so many words, we look up to them to make public policy to benefit us. We look up to them to make our school systems better. We could do it our damn selves. None of us have enough balls to get up there and do that. I know I want to do that, and I'm looking for a community to do that with people to do that with, instead of being on YouTube and talking all goddamn day about the same shit that they're not going to change. But sitting there and just talking doesn't change anything. Sitting up here and making videos and saying what you want to do, but you're not doing shit to change anything. Not going into your community and speaking to people, speaking to your friends. Maybe you got one or two friends that you think might be able to hear the message. They might be able to hear the message, but you speak to them, maybe of community, and they might be able to listen, but they won't really conceptualize it or agree with it. The thing is, you gotta be around like-minded individuals to form a community to change the problems y'all have right now. Okay, I'm back with my phone overheated, but what I'm gonna say right there is, for anybody that's not with this evolution, that doesn't support this evolution of us as a people, fuck them. Fuck you. If you watch my video, fuck you. Unsubscribe from my channel because I don't need no negative shit. I don't need anybody that's not with the evolution of me or us as a people. They can leave. We don't need us anything weighing us down. We don't need extra baggage weighing us down. We don't need any of this negativity, any counter intelligence, any counter arguments against the movement that we trying to form. I'm in search of a community. Now I may have found one, but I'm still looking for bright individuals with the same mindset as me, or who wants a better change in society, who wants a better society for our kids to grow up in, not run through white people, not run through the white elites and the black elites, all these co-inspired coons, all these people. We don't want that anymore. We want a brighter future where we can live in peace of mind, have a peace of mind, and not have to stress and not have to worry about our kids having to rub off on negative people that they're exposed to, when everyone they'll meet will be of likeness and of same mindsets and of same morals and standards that we all share as a community, and not individuality, which never works. That's why black folks have a problem coming together, because we're so disorganized and so brainwashed to hate on any organization that promotes us coming together as a community. We're always being told no, that they're a cult. Any any group you join that's outside of the normal guidelines of society, you're joining the cult. You're joining anything that promotes self help and self growth. It's a cult that you join, which is bullshit because they have a cult out here, and no one's talking about that. No one gets mad at the white man's Illuminati and his cults and shit like that. But then when it comes to us wanting to make our own communities and do for ourselves, it's a problem. So I say, y'all some sick ass people. Whoever thinks like that, fuck you and unsubscribe from my channel because I don't need negative shit like that in my future to come in my evolution. I've had to cut off people this whole week. I've been changing because I know something's coming.
So there was none of this eat low fat foods. He was saying eat more fatty foods, right? And so he actually designed diets that featured beef, veal, mutton, and eggs. So that's what he thought about it. So again, this is more than 100 years ago. The sort of standard of medicine for the treatment of obesity, which acknowledged is not a big problem at the time, is to eat sort of less carbohydrates and more sort of protein and fat. By the 1960s, it's fairly common knowledge. So if you go to books like Dr. Spock's Baby Care, which is a very widespread book, what you see is that they say that rich dessert, the amount of plain starchy foods such as cereals, breads, and potatoes taken, is what determines how much weight they gain or lose. So basically, these sort of starchy foods, sugary foods, that's what causes obesity. That's what they said. And in the British Journal of Nutrition, 1963, every woman knows that carbohydrate is fattening. So it's not sort of this, niche sort of, oh, it's a really weird low carb thing. It's sort of common knowledge. Nobody really disputes that. Nutritionists think that, hey, it's mostly these starchy foods and sugary foods that are causing the obesity crisis. If you were to ask your grandmother or so on, she wouldn't talk about calories because, of course, they didn't really talk about calories back then. They would talk mostly about avoiding sweets and avoiding starchy foods. So where it all begins to change is this great epidemic of coronary disease. So what happened is that Americans in the 1950s and 60s started coming down with a lot of heart attacks. So there was this whole diet heart hypothesis, which said that eating too much fat causes heart disease. So the focus was not on obesity because obesity is not a problem, but the focus is on heart disease. And there's this whole hypothesis that if you eat fat, it clogs your arteries. So that this was developed in the 1950s and 1960s. And so prominent nutritionists like Gene Meyer said that carbohydrate restricted diets, which were common then, were the equivalent of mass murder. So fattening carbohydrates suddenly became healthy whole grains. And if you look at it, you can see this epidemic of heart disease. So you see in the 1900s to the 1950s. So there's no genetic, it's not a genetic thing, right? Clearly something is happening here where US deaths from heart disease really go up from about, say, 100 and less than 150 to like almost 400. So a huge epidemic in heart disease, and everybody's scratching their heads and saying, why are we getting so much heart disease in the 50s and 60s? President Eisenhower had a heart attack. It was a huge, huge problem. Well, if you look at cigarette consumption, of course, we know now, and we didn't back then, of course, the tobacco companies said, no. Tobacco doesn't cause any kind of heart disease, doesn't cause any cancer, right? It's great. But you can see from the per capita cigarette consumption that it goes from virtually zero in 1900 to like a lot, right? So all the GIs go to World War II, they come back and they're all smoking. So if you look at the prevalence of smoking in the 50s and 60s, it's somewhere around 40-50% of the population. Like everybody's smoking. You look at old pictures, people are smoking. You go to restaurants, there's the smoking sections, right? There's the little ashtrays and the little in the cars and the airplane seats. There's little ashtrays. So it's something that's very common. And this is where people were. So by the time you hit the 60s, you had the Surgeon General report, and then after that, it starts to dip. And you can see, of course, the very close correlation with that and heart disease. But in the 60s, nobody knew what was going on because tobacco, everybody knew, was good for you. So they said, oh my God, why are Americans having heart attacks? Must be the dietary fat, right? Because it can't be the cigarettes. And the guy who really pushed that was a guy named Ansel Keys, who was a very, very prominent nutritionist. So he developed the K rations, which were used in World War II. So he was really the top scientist of his day. And he did this 7-country study. And he said that, well, look, here's 7 countries. And if you compare the percentage of calories of fat and the heart disease deaths, you see a very close correlation. Therefore, it must be the fat, and more specifically, it was the saturated fat. So that was his hypothesis, and you see he's on the cover of Time magazine. So it really carries a lot of weight. But if you think about it, it doesn't make any sense at all. Because if you look at the actual consumption of saturated fat from 1900 to 1960, when heart disease deaths peaked, you can see that it's virtually unchanged, right? So while cigarette smoking is going way up, at the same time as heart disease, saturated fat is eating exactly the same. So it makes no sense at all to blame the dietary intake of saturated fat, which is exactly the same, as causing all the heart disease deaths. Yeah. Yeah, the question is about the 7-country study about the saturated fat. That 7-country study was a huge study. There's a whole ton of sort of secondary study. It's one of these studies that has like 50 sub studies, and that was one of them. The saturated fat. You can dig it back. It was published in the 1970s. Yeah, directly related to heart disease. And that's where we got this whole thing about eating more unsaturated fats and eating less saturated fats, which we went for a long time. If you remember the old, I don't know if you were in medical school at the time, but there's the old AHA step 1, step 2 diets, if you remember, super low fat or super low fat for heart disease. And that's where we got to in 1977, where we got to this dietary goals for the United States. And specifically, they said decrease the fat consumption from about 40% to 30% and raise consumption of carbohydrates to about 55 to 60% of calories. So the problem with some of this data that came out was that the 7-country study was, one, epidemiological. So there's a lot of confounders. But the other thing is that he didn't actually look at every country that he had data on. He actually just took the 7 countries that best fit the line and sort of stuck them there. So if you look at all 22 countries that he had data on, it was a much less tight correlation. So he sort of cherry picked the data to make his point look better, but he also ignored the sort of within country comparison. That is, you can compare the dietary fat in the United States, forgetting all these other countries, and see if it has increased that should have caused this increase. And of course, there was none of that. And so for the next sort of 30 years or so, we tried to pin heart disease on saturated fat or total fat. And virtually every single study that we did found no correlation. So 1963, you have a longitudinal study of coronary heart disease, no relationship of dietary fat to coronary artery disease. 1977, the same thing. 1978, same thing. In 1980, you had this 10,000 patient study followed over 6 years with no relationship of coronary artery disease and dietary fat. So it sort of went on and on. They kept trying to prove the point that eating fat clogs your arteries and causes heart attacks, but every single time they looked, they actually couldn't find it. What they found instead was something very surprising, which is that as you ate more fat, you actually had less disease. So, for example, in this study, they followed 8,000 men and looked at their dietary risk factors and risk of stroke. So if you look at that blue bar, that's the amount of dietary fat. They break them into quintiles. That is, Q5 is the people who eat the most fat, and Q1 is the people who eat the least fat. And their risk of stroke goes down substantially when they eat more fat. So it actually doesn't look like eating a lot of fat is risky. It's actually kind of protective. A 20-year follow-up of the Framingham data. So not some crappy little study, but a huge, well-followed study in 1997 showed the same thing. So again, breaking down into quintiles, they looked at who had the lowest intake of fat, and that's those people at the top who have the highest risk of stroke, and compared it to the people who had the eating the most fat, which had the lowest risk of stroke. So fat was not risky at all, actually substantially protective. And this is 20-year prospective data, which is a hell of a lot better than what Ansel Keys did, which was a sort of one single cross-sectional study at the time. In Malmo, Sweden, they did another huge sort of study of almost 30,000 men and women. Again, breaking down into quartiles, Q4, which eats the most fat, seems to have about sort of 35% less risk of heart disease than the people who eat the most fat. So nothing much here to support this sort of dietary fat hypothesis. In fact, quite the opposite. It seems to point the wrong way. By 2009, you had a number of studies published. So this is published in the Archives of Internal Medicine that really looked at meta-analyses of all these studies we've done. So this is 2009. So this is like 30 plus years after we've been telling people to eat very low fat. And when you look at the sort of total fat, saturated fat, you see the risk hazard ratio. So it's 0.99 for total fat for either coronary outcomes or secondary outcomes. Really, at 1.0, you see that there's no correlation at all between eating more fat and higher risk or less fat and higher risk. There really is no correlation at all. And this is over, if you look at the number of patients, it's like 160,000 patients that we've studied. So we can't find really any evidence at all that eating more fat is dangerous. And the randomized control trials, there were just none that showed that it was risky, right? And we were telling people left and right with these step 1 diets, step 2 diets to eat less and less fat. This is all through the 80s and the 90s. And there was no evidence. So even though we pretend that we follow evidence-based medicine, we were going on no evidence and just telling people to eat low fat just because that was the way that's what we told everybody, right? So eat less fat, but there was no data. Actually, the data suggested the opposite. And in 1989, you started to see some changes. So this is the diet and reinfarction trial, which is a kind of classic trial, which was a randomized control trial that really wanted to prove the point that eating less fat would reduce heart disease. So it was a secondary prevention trial. And if you look at fat advice versus low fat advice, you see that there's no benefit to eating low fat diets. And then they had this huge randomized control trial called the Women's Health Initiative, which randomized almost 50,000 women to a low-fat diet. So you can see that the total energy, they reduced their intake by about 360 calories. They reduced their fat intake from about 40% to 30% and increased their carbohydrates from about 44 to 52%. So exactly what we told people to do, which is eat less fat, eat more carbohydrates. So this, then they looked at, hey, is there any benefits to heart disease? They increased their exercise by about 10%. So these are metabolic equivalents. And this was the result, published in 2006, 13 years ago. You see for MI, cardiac deaths, revascularization, or stroke, no difference. That is, eating less fat didn't make any difference whatsoever. But there was other data. So the Lions Diet Heart study, of course, looked at this low-fat diet. And what they found in 1994 was that this sort of Mediterranean diet, which is a sort of vague term, did way better. There was a 75% risk reduction in people who are eating more of these fatty fish and olive oil and all these sorts of stuff compared to the sort of standard low-fat advice that we had given people. And other data, for example, for nuts. Nuts were very high in fat. They are very high in fat. And for years, we told people, don't eat nuts because they're super high in fat. Same with avocados. Don't eat avocados. They're super high in fat. And the Adventist Health Study, for example, showed that if you eat a lot of nuts, it's actually substantially protective for heart disease. So that's when things started to change, and we started talking about healthy fats, right? Whereas before there was no healthy fats. In the 90s, all fats were bad. So we can take a look at the saturated fats. People said, okay, well, maybe the unsaturated fats are still bad for you. And the saturated fats that you see in like meat, for example, dairy, maybe those are still really, really bad for you. And these are the animal fats for the most part. So if you compare beef, for example, it's mostly saturated compared to cottonseed oil, which is mostly sort of omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. And butter is the same thing. So you can see, first of all, that all sort of natural sources of fat contain a mixture of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. So the sort of, if you look at the monounsaturated, which a lot of people think are quite beneficial, you can look at like butter, for example, or beef tallow. There's a lot of monounsaturated fat in there. There's a lot of saturated fat too, but there's a lot of monounsaturated. So it's not like pure saturated fat. And you can see that after the sort of 50s and 60s, butter consumption really dropped off a cliff because we told people that dietary fat, saturated fat is not that good for you. And we switched instead to vegetable oils, right? So this is where we told people you should stop eating butter and you should eat margarine instead. That's where it came from. And again, by the late 90s and 2000s, as we're trying to find the evidence to show that it's really harmful, the evidence actually shows the exact opposite. So this is the health professionals follow-up study, which was published in the BMJ. It's a huge sort of prospective study of health professionals. I think Harvard runs that. And again, they break it into quintiles. Q5 is the people who eat the most saturated fat, and they still have substantially less heart attacks than the people who eat the least. So Q1, Q2. So eating more fat doesn't really appear to be all that harmful. 2009, there's a big meta-analysis again, looking at all the studies that have been done over the last 30, 40 years at saturated fat specifically. And what they find at the bottom is that for heart disease, the top group is for heart disease, there's really no correlation between how much saturated fat you eat and heart disease. If you look at stroke, they're actually maybe slightly protective. And newer epidemiologic studies, which are looking at sort of many countries instead of just 7 countries, find that if you take more saturated fat, you have less heart disease. So totally the opposite of what we had been taught and we had been teaching people for decades. This cohort of almost 60,000 Japanese men looked at saturated fat intake and mortality from cardiovascular disease. So again, quintile 5 is eating the most saturated fat, and they have substantially less heart disease than the others. Risk of diabetes shows the same thing. So the more fat you eat, the less diabetes that you get. Inflammation, because we know now it's not a matter of sort of clogging up the arteries, but it's actually an inflammatory disease. You can look at CRP or HOMA, which is a measure of insulin resistance. And again, quintile 5 is far less. So the people who eat the most saturated fat have less inflammation and less insulin resistance. And of course, we actually knew all this. We called it the French paradox. So from the 80s and 90s, again, what we said was, oh, saturated fat's really bad for you. And we know that the French eat lots of total fat. They're eating cream, they're eating butter, they're eating lots of animal fat, and yet they have half the heart disease that Americans did. And this for years was called the French paradox. But of course, it was never a paradox. The fat just didn't have any correlation whatsoever to heart disease, despite what we had been told on no evidence. And of course, that's what set us off looking at, oh, is it the wine? Is it this? Is it that? But really, the fat just wasn't part of the story. And that's why even in the mainstream news, like Time Magazine, you've gone from sort of don't ever eat saturated fat to the 2000s where it's like, oh, you should eat butter. And this is a total change in the last sort of 40 years. We went from eating butter to not eating butter and back to eating butter. So if you look at margarine sales, for example, and butter, butter went way down in the 50s and 60s. We all switched to margarine, and then margarine sort of sales are now plummeting, and giant companies like Unilever are trying desperately to get out of it, right? And as people ate more butter, there's always a few naysayers that said, oh, people are going to get so much heart disease. And so this is data from Sweden. If you look at butter consumption on the right-hand side, that's that yellow bar, that's butter consumption. You can see around 2000, the Swedes start to eat a lot of butter. And if you look at their death from coronary cardiovascular disease, it just kind of continues the same downward trend. So there's no increase, right? A lot of the people were saying, wow, they're going to get so much heart attacks. It just didn't happen. And it's already been like 15 years that they've all switched back to butter. And finally, in the Lancet, so there's this study called the PURE study, which Salim Yusuf, sort of this very, very prominent cardiologist from McMaster, spearheaded. So a massive epidemiological study, 18 countries, 135,000 people over 7 years. And so they're trying to sort of recreate this epidemiologic study to say, hey, if people are eating more fat or less fat or whatever, are they going to die more often or going to get more heart attacks? So if you look, starting from the left, that's the energy from total fat. So as as you eat more and more fat, what you see with the total mortality on the top or major cardiovascular disease, it goes down as you eat more fat, right? And this is from like just 2 years ago, right? This is the most recent data we have. If you look at saturated fat, it's the same thing. As you eat more and more saturated fat, you're getting less and less heart disease risk. Yes, it sort of goes back up towards unity, but there's no correlation. Monounsaturated fats, again, as you eat more that's monounsaturated fat, risk seems to go down. And again, with nuts and olive oil, that's where a lot of people are thinking these are pretty good sources of fat, but you got to realize butter and animal fats also have a significant proportion of monounsaturated fat. And what caused a lot of heart disease? Well, that's that last bar at the right, which was total carbohydrate, energy from carbohydrates as a percentage. So as you eat a higher and higher percentage of carbohydrate, your mortality just goes up and up, right? And this is exactly what we told people to do. We told people to eat more carbohydrate and less fat. But the epidemiologic evidence actually says that you should be doing the exact opposite of what we told people all those sort of the last 30 or 40 years. So this gets me to the story of vegetable oil, which is very, very interesting. And it sort of starts back in the 1900s, and everybody thinks that vegetable oil is really so good for you. But if you look at the origins of it, it actually came from garbage. So why did we eat vegetable oil? Well, cotton was the first one. So it was cultivated in the United States in the 1700s. And in the South, right, they had all those slaves which were picking cotton. So they had lots of cotton. But each 100 pounds of cotton also produced 162 pounds of totally useless cotton seeds. So you needed like 2% of the seeds to plant new cotton. But the rest was just garbage. So they had these huge heaps, tons and tons and tons of cotton seeds, which they would dump into the river. And of course, eventually somebody found them out, and then they sued the companies, and then they had to do something with it. So then they thought, okay, well, by the 1850s, the technology advanced to the point where they could actually use it for lighting oil, which was great. Until in Pennsylvania, they discovered oil. So they drill a hole in the ground, and all of a sudden there's all this oil. So the market for cottonseed oil as a source of lighting, and remember before that they had whale oil, and that's really what saved the whales was this discovery of oil. They were getting extinct because people were using this whale oil to light their lamps. So anyway, so now what we're going to do with these sort of heaping mounds of toxic waste, you had all this cottonseed that's just rotting away. So what are you going to do with it? Well, why don't we feed it to people? That was a good idea. So that's what Crisco was. So it's crystallized cottonseed oil. There's actually no evidence that giving cotton seeds to people is any good for you because you don't eat your t-shirt, right? So why would you give this to people? There's no evidence. But hey, when you took cottonseed oil, it looks kind of like oil. So you could blend it into olive oil and you could feed it to people. Well, so that's what they did. And of course, Italy got really mad and they actually banned all American olive oil because it was all adulterated with cottonseed oil. And the whole vegetable oil industry actually started because it was cheap, not because it was healthy, because your feedstock, of course, is garbage. So it's free. So what Crisco did, which was very innovative at the time, was they hydrogenated these oils. So you have this all vegetable shortening. Hydrogenation, partial hydrogenation, is of course trans fats, which of course had never been in the human diet. But here it was, Crisco looked like food, so let's sell it as food, right? That was the whole idea. But it came from garbage and it was cheap. That was the only reason we ever thought it was good. So that's how we got margarine, with all this partially hydrogenated soybean oil. Prior to that, it was cottonseed oil. And everybody thinks it's really, really pure and nice, right? But it's actually not, because what you have to do to get vegetable oil is a whole lot of processing. So if you take olive oil, for example, you take olives, you squish it and get the oil. That's extra virgin olive oil. If you take corn oil, corn is not oily, like in the least. So what you have to do is you actually have to take tons of corn, you press it, then you spray hexane on it, which is a petroleum derivative like gasoline, so that you can actually drag all this oil out. Then you have to refine it, remove it, degum it, bleach it. And then it's like all natural, healthy vegetable oil. So it's highly, highly, highly processed. And our bodies, of course, are not used to sort of processing all this. So lately, of course, we've realized that, hey, all these omega-6s have thrown our omega-6 to omega-3 ratios totally out of whack, which is highly inflammatory, which is super bad for you. But, you know, for a long time, we thought, hey, vegetable oil's nice and healthy. They look healthy. And of course, that's how we got into this whole trans fat mess, because we told people to stop eating butter and eat more margarine. But margarine was, of course, partially hydrogenated vegetable oils or trans fats. And then by 1997, you had studies from Framingham. This is 20-year follow-up data from Framingham, which showed that people who ate a lot of margarine were like dying a lot. And it's like, now, of course, it doesn't seem like a surprise because they're eating a ton of trans fats. But the data to suggest that vegetable oils were beneficial was actually highly suspect. So if you look at, this is from 2013 in the BMJ, if you look at people who were in this Sydney Diet Heart study,